Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Iran's armed forces will hold a joint 4-day naval exercise with Russia and China in the northern part of the Indian Ocean, a spokesman said Wednesday. The drill, which is to start on Saturday, will be the first such trilateral exercise as Tehran seeks to boost military cooperation with Beijing and Moscow amid unprecedented economic sanctions from Washington. Visits to Iran by Russian and Chinese naval representatives have also stepped up in recent years. Iranian military spokesman said the joint maneuvers, which are aimed at promoting regional security, will extend as far as the Gulf of Oman. The drill is seen as a response to recent U.S. maneuvers with its regional ally Saudi Arabia, in which China also participated. It's interesting because the northern reaches of Indian Ocean have important littoral states and have some of the busiest and most important sea lanes of communication. Is this power projection for China and Russia and naval security for Iran? To discuss this, we are joined by Syed Mohammad Marandi, who joins us from Tehran, and Mr. Einar Tangen, who joins us from Beijing. Both keep a close watch on political and geopolitical and security developments. Thank you to both gentlemen here. Let me go to Mr. Tangen. Mr. Tangen, is this China's power projection in this part of the world? It's like going to the Indian Ocean along the lines that the U.S. shows its flag in East China Sea or South China Sea. So China is now wanting to do this?
Not really. I mean, if you have to look at it from a strategic point of view, China is the largest buyer of oil that is shipped through the Straits of Hormuz. It has an absolute vital security interest in making sure that it's a peaceful transit, and that goes both ways. China and Iran had a joint military exercise in 2017, but China has also had joint military exercises with Saudi Arabia. And the idea for China is to keep things cool, not to have any kind of breakout, because that would threaten their very vital oil supplies.
Okay, let me interject. You're right. I mean, this is vital security interest for China. Mr. Marandi, is this naval security for Iran with one rising power and also with Russia, which is trying to effect a pushback as far as the U.S. influence in Europe is concerned?
It's pretty clear that the fact that these three major powers are working together, it's not just Iran and China or Iran and Russia or Russia and China. The fact that the three are carrying out these maneuvers together has a significance. And all three of these countries are opposed to the current status quo, where the United States has traditionally been the sole power. And on the other hand, these countries are all rising powers, Iran in the region, China globally, and Russia, of course, somewhere in between. So it is significant. I think it does send a message, although I think it's a very subtle message. The objective for these maneuvers is, the stated objective is for peace and to fight against terrorism and to support peaceful trade among different countries. But again, as I said, because these three countries are doing it together and it's only these three countries, I think it does send a very subtle message. And the United States and the EU have responded. They are not happy about the maneuvers.
Mr. Tangen, the Americans are also very interested in ensuring that these locks are secure. So China doesn't really need to have any concern on that, because in that part of the world, in Southeast Asia, in the Far East, the U.S. also has its allies. So wasn't it enough for the U.S. Navy, along with its allies, to be there and ensuring that everything goes smoothly?
Yes, I mean, the point about China is that they're trying to make sure that there's no kind of interference. As far as the U.S. is concerned, remember, the U.S. is now not a net user of Middle Eastern oil. It is actually a competitor. And as we've seen just this last week with Nord Stream 2, they're actually trying to interfere in the transportation of oil directly from Russia to Europe, despite the fact that Europe wants this deal, and they're very dependent. If this pipeline were to go through, for example, it would be far less expensive to use Russian gas as opposed to American gas, which would have to be liquefied and sent on tankers. So in this particular area, there is some suspicion by China that the U.S. would benefit if, in fact, there is some sort of problem in that area. Now, also remember that for most of the world, the U.S. is mainly responsible for a lot of the things, the unrest that is going on there, whether it's Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. The whole area itself has become, a very, very difficult area. And a lot of people say that it was due to these invasions, which have just resulted in more difficulties.
Okay, since we don't have an American on the panel, let me try and mount an argument from that side. The Nord Stream pipeline that you're talking about is mostly overground. We were talking about these blocks, and you're absolutely right that the U.S. is now a competitor, is not actually a user of the Middle Eastern oil. But there are lots of U.S. allies in the region that need, supply of oil and gas undisturbed by other events. So it seems to me that it's more than just the security aspect of it, the energy security for China. It's also, as Mr. Marandi also said, there's a subtle message in terms of, showing the flag.
Well, I think you're reading too much into it. I mean, if China was only doing military exercises with Iran, I think that would be the clear message. But actually, they just completed naval maneuvers with Saudi Arabia and the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. But here's the thing: it's a master stroke, frankly, in the sense that you have the presence, you have the flag outreach, but at the same time you're playing both sides, so you're there and you're also doing it masterfully, and I think that's a great strategy.
I don't know that it's necessarily the strategy. I think they're just literally trying to make sure that the area does not go up in flames. You have, vast 60% of the world's oil that's exported is going through the Straits of Hormuz. Anything that affects China will also affect Japan, South Korea, India, etc. So when you say that China is trying to make political points, I think you should really think about it in terms of how the U.S. is now positioned, given that it doesn't rely on this. We have not been very nice to our, quote, allies. And there's a lot of unilateral sanctions. A lot of countries feel that we're interfering in their sovereign issues. So at this point, it's hard to know exactly where Donald Trump wants to go. He's unpredictable. That's the only predictable thing about him. So at this point, I think China is just trying to keep a lid on a situation which they see as very volatile until this kind of post-Trump world emerges.
Okay, back to Mr. Marandi. Mr. Marandi, what Mr. Tangen is saying essentially is geopolitics. And I stick to the point that I was raising, that this is a masterstroke in the sense that China is there. It is a rising power. And when a power rises, it obviously begins to challenge subtly or sometimes not so subtly the power that exists. And that is the United States of America. And Mr. Tangen is absolutely right. There are a number of countries in the region, in the greater Middle East, who are not particularly happy with U.S. policies over many decades. And Iran certainly is one such state that has been in the U.S. crosshairs since the Iranian Revolution. So once again, give me a sense of what there is in this for Iran, apart from naval security that I was talking about.
Well, again, I think the message is very subtle. And the Chinese among the three participants want to keep it more subtle because that's how the Chinese do things. They try not to make a lot of noise. But it is the Chinese are using their most advanced technology. A very new destroyer is participating, and it's not a bilateral maneuver between Iran and China. This is trilateral, and it's Iran, China, and Russia, and that's what really makes it significant. The Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese are all playing down the maneuver, and they say that it's anti-terrorism and to support peaceful shipping. But the fact that it is these countries that are working together does carry a significant message. It is subtle. It is not meant to disturb the markets. But the very fact that the Americans have reacted to this and the EU has reacted to it is, I think, it's clear that they have received this subtle message.
They have received the subtle message. I'll come back to you with the questions, Mr. Marandi, but let me go back to Mr. Tangen before I let him go. Mr. Tangen, give me a sense of how China is looking at the region as a whole. So you have your strategic partnership with Pakistan. You also interested in a peaceful resolution of issues in Afghanistan, and now there is this trilateral exercise, naval exercise with Iran. So what exactly is the objective? And, beyond just going resolving issues, and how much capital China is prepared to expend to do that?
Well, okay, if you're looking for purely geopolitical, I mean, China has made no secret of its ambitions with the Belt and Road Initiative to kind of spread this trade routes throughout not only the Middle East, Africa, Europe, but now South America, even Australia. So here's a global trade network, which is in essence going to be replacing the WTO, which is now toothless. So from the Chinese perspective, this is very important. China has a very low resources per population. It is therefore forced to buy resources from other countries. This is beneficial to especially resource-rich countries, and then try to make it back by adding value to goods and reselling them in the international market or domestically. So this is China's, effort. It's about economic progress, escaping the middle income trap, creating regional peace and stability. That is the real message. I don't think it's anything subtle about it. China has been very clear that it supports the JCPOA, that it has taken sides with Iran, as Russia has also, on the issue of weaponizing the SWIFT system. And I think you should see those things for what they are as opposed to reading in. China is just simply trying to balance these things. You call it a masterstroke. They think of it as survival.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Einar speaking with us from Beijing. Let me go back to Mr. Marandi. Mr. Marandi, recently the disturbances in Iran, the Iranian leadership said that these issues are essentially exploited by external forces. But I was speaking to some Iranian dissenters, and they said, well, the issues are intrinsic to multiple fault lines within Iran. Would you give us a sense of how you read this situation?
Well, I don't think anyone in Iran has said that this is simply foreign instigated. In fact, no one said that the initial demonstrations had anything to do with foreign powers at all. And Iran is a country with many political parties, many political factions. Our parliament is divided into three main factions as we speak, and we have elections in 3-4 months. So you have many views in Iran. But the reality is that people were very dissatisfied with the Rouhani administration's the way in which they carried out the fuel hikes. But the protest that happened in different cities across the country were peaceful. No one was killed, no one was injured, no one was arrested. And it was only late that night where we had a very sudden rise in riots, where the rioters in many different cities were very well equipped, and foreign media, because Iran is very unique in the sense that Western countries have many Persian language TV channels which they beam into Iran that are very hostile towards Iran. BBC Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, VOA Persian, Saudi Arabia has their own channel, Euronews Persian. There are literally more altogether. There are more than 100 Persian language media channels based in the West, more than that which exists in Iran. And you can imagine how much money they're spending. There's a huge online army of Iranian terrorists.
You're basically saying that they've been beaming messages that are obviously anti-Iran. I went back to that issue, Mr. Marandi, but I'm also joined by Mr. Pyotr Kortunov, who joins me from Moscow. He's program assistant for Iran at the Russian International Affairs Council. Mr. Kortunov, thank you for being on the program. We were talking about the trilateral joint naval exercise between Iran, China, and Russia. Give me a sense of what's the play there is in this for Moscow.
Hello. So I believe that the primary objective of Moscow in the Russian aspect is more symbolic than it is pragmatic. What I'm trying to say is that holding this kind of joint exercises together with Iran is mostly a signal both to Iran and all the regional parties involved, here, etc. A signal that despite all the pressure, all the efforts of the United States to isolate Iran both politically and economically, the Islamic Republic still maintains a lot of support from such key powerful players as Russia, China. At the same time, Russia really wants to demonstrate to the rest of the Middle East that despite maintaining great relationships and enhancing relationships with such regional players, which also happen to be Iran's rivals in the region, like, for example, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, etc., Russia still isn't willing and going to abandon the role of an independent, unbiased mediator in the region. So Russia still wants to show that the Moscow is willing to acknowledge and respect all the interests of all the regional parties, including Iran. But at the same time, as I already mentioned, this step is really far from being pragmatic or practical, because at the end of the day, Russia hasn't undertaken any kind of obligations, and it is not binding. This move is not binding on Russia in any way. So it's more like a gesture to both Iran and the Middle East in general.
Okay, but Mr. Kortunov, we've seen that Russia quite overtly has been pushing back, especially in its former near abroad in Europe, what it considers as U.S. influence. So it has also, in many ways, partnered with Beijing, because Beijing is also pushing the U.S. influence back. Now, Beijing is also a rising power. So is Moscow now prepared to play the second fiddle to Beijing in this partnership?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I don't think that this move from Russia should be regarded as a kind of element of a global strategy of either diminishing or completely eliminating the influence of the United States, both in the global aspect and in the Middle East. First of all, this is because
I was talking more about the overall strategy of Moscow as far as the pushback is concerned, not just this particular exercise.
Well, in general, of course, Moscow regards China as a very valid party in pushing against the influence of United States, both in Europe and in other parts of the world. But again, coming back to this issue, I don't think that this one should be regarded as a part of the strategy. Of course, China is going to be part of influence exported by Moscow into Europe and other parts of the world, but I do not believe that this kind of exercise, any partnership with Iran or a solution in the Middle East is going to be a part of that. So it's going to be standing as kind of common pursuit of common interests of both Moscow and Beijing in the region, who both want to see Iran as a stable country, both economically and from the security perspective, but it's not going to be more than that.
It's not going to be more than that. That's Mr. Pyotr Kortunov speaking with us from Moscow. Mr. Marandi, back to what we were talking about, and you said that everything was fine until the rioting began, and you also mentioned that there are a number of external players that beam Persian channels into Iran. So my sense is, from what you said, that there was this kind of propaganda that was impacting people within Iran. But that still raises the question of why this impact if there are no internal fault lines.
No, I was about to say that there are multiple layers, and there were also the rioters were very well trained, very well organized, very swift, and they were being coordinated from outside the country. So you had, for example, a single group of people that would destroy 6 banks in less than an hour. They would go from bank to bank and just destroy. And or another group would destroy petrol stations. There were military attacks near the border with Iraq on Iran's refineries and oil and gas installations. So this was not an ordinary state of affairs. And Iranian intelligence says that these attacks were supposed to be carried out actually in January. But because of the fuel hikes and because people came to the streets to protest the rise in the price of fuel, these groups used this opportunity to put forward these operations that they carried out in the country. So the Iranians believe that, or the Iranian intelligence has said that they have those who've been arrested are linked to regional countries. So again, I have to stress the point that in Iran, the protests had nothing to do with the violent riots. The protests passed off peacefully. When the riots began, the protesters had basically left the streets.
Okay, thank you. That was Syed Mohammad speaking with us from Tehran. We shall take a short break and return to discuss Sino-Japanese relations. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on Wednesday told Chinese Premier Li Keqiang that there would be no true improvement in bilateral relations without stability in the East China Sea. The statement was put out by Japan's foreign ministry. The two leaders held a bilateral meeting in the Chinese city of Chengdu on the sidelines of a trilateral summit with South Korea. It was the two leaders' 7th meeting. The previous one was held in November. Japan's foreign ministry said Mr. Abe told Mr. Lee he wanted to sustain recent improvements in ties between the two countries through the promotion of constant high-level exchanges and dialogues. Mr. Abe also urged Mr. Lee to swiftly remove import restrictions on Japanese food products, the ministry said in a summary of the meeting. Mr. Lee was quoted as saying that the momentum has been maintained for improving Sino-Japanese ties. They're now back on a normal track. Tensions between China and Japan over the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands dates back to 1895. China began asserting rights to the area in the 1970s. To discuss where matters stand, we have with us Mr. Joseph Cheng, who joins us from Hong Kong. Mr. Cheng is a political scientist and democracy activist. We also have with us Mr. Dawson, He's a geopolitical analyst, who's also a political radio host. He joins us from Osaka in Japan. And Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung, who is a strategist on China at Andrew Leung International Consultancy, joins us from London. Thank you to all the gentlemen here. Mr. Cheng, let's begin with you. How serious is the situation? I had this crisis sort of, tracker report, which said that while, as you know, to avoid accidental clashes at air and sea, China and Japan announced a new crisis communication hotline in June 2018. And although Japan's Ministry of Defense reported the number of times Japan's military had to scramble jets in response to Chinese air incursions went down 41% in 2017. That number increased in 2018 and is on trend to continue increasing in 2019. So where does the situation stand? I mean, Mr. Abe's statement, as put out by the Japanese Foreign Ministry, seems to suggest that there was some serious talk about this with Mr. Lee.
Well, the situation is not that bad. As you can see, leaders from 3 countries just held a summit, and at a bilateral level, Sino-Japanese relations have been restored to a state of normalization. Xi Jinping is expected to visit Japan in the first half of next year, following the visit of the Japanese Prime Minister to China. Basically, the 2 countries and South Korea are now heading towards a free trade agreement among themselves. But of course, China and Japan have been involved in a bilateral territorial dispute over the Diaoyu Islands, and as well as a dispute over the demarcation of the exclusive economic zones, relating also to mining and fishing rights. These territorial disputes are not expected to be resolved in the near future. However, Japan, as you just mentioned, is very concerned with the frequent patrolling activities of China near the Diaoyu Islands. And Japan certainly would like to see these activities to be scaled down. But on the other hand, China also believes that it needs to demonstrate its claims over the territorial sovereignty of the group of islands. But if economic issues can be resolved, if a trade agreement can be settled, then these things, these patrolling activities may well be scaled down. And as we have noticed, various types of hotlines, confidence-building measures have also been introduced. I think both countries understand that it is in their interest to avoid military escalation.
Okay. Mr. Dawson, what is the Japanese point of view? I mean, this was, I think, back in 2014 when President Barack Obama said that the disputed islands are covered by the U.S.-Japanese Security Treaty. But he did not take a formal position, and it appeared at that time that, the U.S. was concerned about some kind of accidental military incident or political miscalculation by either China or Japan, and he did not really want the U.S. to be caught between the two. So how exactly are the Japanese approaching this?
Well, I believe that you have to see some background here with China's sour relationships with the United States, Trump's tariffs on China, and souring relations between South Korea and Japan. Japan took South Korea off their favored white list, and then there have been boycotts against Japanese goods. And so because of this, you're seeing an opportunity for Japan and China to warm relations. And Japan is bringing up the dispute from Senkaku Dayu Lionel Court Islands, as well as Spratly Islands, the whole South China Sea, they said, because that automatically gains them allies with Malaysia, Vietnam, and other countries that have issues and island disputes with China. Sort of lingering behind all the island dispute mess is really resentment from World War II. And that is just not something you can really negotiate. You can't come to the negotiating table wearing World War II on your vest. It's not going to go anywhere. But Japan knows that by bringing up this issue, that it automatically puts all the other
Dawson,
smaller nations that China bullies in line with themselves.
Mr. Dawson, without prejudice to the point you're making with reference to World War II, I mean, these particular islands have been with Japan for the last nearly 120 years, which is much before the Second World War.
Oh, well, yeah, from their point of view, it's Sankaku and it's Japanese, and things really went south quite recently, even though, China has made some claims since the 70s. They've been Japanese far longer than that, and they were sold from two private owners to the Japanese government. So it only went from private Japanese hands to the Japanese government. China really didn't have a claim in that whatsoever. The problem was that when that was happening, Japan happened to have a very right-wing governor of Tokyo who would not shut his mouth and just made things worse. Yes, it was sold from it's not really a dispute. It went from Japanese hands to Japanese hands again. But a lot of the Chinese public jumped on the island issue, who didn't even know about the island issue until the media told them about it. Really, the fuel, though, is resentment from World War II that has not been resolved. And you see this a lot with South Korea as well. That what got them kicked off the white list is because they started demanding that Mitsubishi and private Japanese companies pay reparations, even though the Japanese government already paid reparations. And that was just too much. And they ended up getting off the favored list for this.
Okay. Mr. Leung, how do you read into this situation?
Well, let's face it. I mean, the Senkaku Islands or the Diaoyu Islands problem has been with us for many years. And even before the current trade war between China and the United States, that's been going on. And what has changed? I think that there's quite a significant change in the relationship between China and Japan. They're already talking about a possible future visit of President Xi to Japan. And Japan, of course, Mr. Abe is making visits to China as sending out overtures. And why is this warming up to China? This reflects a kind of increased need for hedging against not too reliable United States with this military umbrella. Trump is now is not on all fours with Japan, even though the Trump administration relies on Japan as an integral part of the so-called Quad, a kind of pushback into China, pushback against China's expanding influence. The Quad being, of course, the United States, Canada, Australia, and Japan. But against this United States wish to rebalance the rivalry in the South China Sea, including the East China Sea, Japan is feeling that perhaps the Trump administration is not entirely reliable. And so Abe wants to hedge against this by warming up to China. But against this background, though, there is no way that, of course, Abe could back down on the Diaoyu Islands or the Senkaku Islands. And, of course, the stability of the East China Sea and the South China Sea affects not only Japan, but the other East Asian nations. I think all nations in that area want stability. They don't want a war, and they don't want to take sides or choose sides between the United States and China, because when the two giants fight and the smaller nations get trampled. So I think that we are seeing a delicate rebalance. On the one hand, is a great play of great nation rivalry between the United States and China, particularly over the South China Sea. Don't forget the South China Sea to China is not just territorial issues, it's also a conduit of the trade and raw materials and components which underpin China's economy and indeed the stability of the Chinese Communist Party. So for China, the South China Sea is extremely important. But to America also, America doesn't want the South China Sea to be turned into a Chinese lake when sandbanks are now turned into fortified islands. So I think that we're seeing a rebalance of forces, and in which Japan, of course, plays a very important part. And Abby would like to hedge various extents.
Okay. Mr. Cheng, there was also this four-point consensus document that Japan and China signed back in 2015. Is that document still the basis for any discussions on these disputed islands?
I don't think there has been any final settlement. There were attempts on both sides to shelve the territorial issue and engage in exploration of oil and other resources in the disputed areas. But it is extremely difficult to engage in joint exploration without settling the territorial issue. When relations are good, then there may be some partial agreements and mutual tolerance. When relations are bad, then these become tipping points, pressure points, and can easily lead to escalation of nationalism in both countries. At the moment, I don't think both countries are ready for any genuine final settlement. As we were saying, they are now only succeeding more or less in confidence-building measures, in establishment of hotlines.
Okay.
They may, if relations continue to improve, they may have some partial agreement to have some exploration and exploitation activities to be started. Even this is very, very optimistic.
Okay. Final question to Mr. Dawson before wrap up. Mr. Dawson, this whole business of Chinese incursions into the area and the Japanese scrambling jets and all of this, how serious is this issue? I mean, because lots of analysts talk about the idea of some kind of miscalculation, and apparently this year the number of times that Japan scrambled jets increased, although in 2017 it had decreased. So how serious is that, or is just too much alarmism going on?
You never want to be wrong about this, but it is a lot of alarmist hoo-ha. China and Japan both use these disputes to justify massive naval budgets. Japan just passed its largest military spending bill in history by considerable gaps even from last year. It's got a lot to do with American pressure and bases as well. And so it's a bit of saber-rattling. There's not really a serious threat of Japan and China going to war again. But, scrambling jets or playing chicken in the water with ships and things like that is enough to feed the public, especially the right-wing elements in both countries, to trigger them and justify budgets and spending on the military. And so it's more of a budgetary tactic than any kind of serious threat.
Okay.
Japan runs those islands. They run the water. China can claim whatever it wants. At the end of the day, Japan doesn't have to do anything. They already control everything. So China can whine all it wants.
Thank you, Mr. Joseph Cheng, Mr. Ryan Dawson, and Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung. This is all for tonight from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.